The hangar bay of the obsidian colossus trembled with a silence more violent than any weapon discharge. 50 armored guards formed a semicircle around the small figure at the center, their plasma rifles humming with barely contained storms. The air tasted of ozone and fear. Thomas Caldwell, 68 years old, gray hair still military short despite 2 decades since his last deployment, hands calloused from maintenance work rather than surgery, stood perfectly still. A bronze talon longer than his forearm rested against his throat, the edge sharp enough to part skin with the weight of a breath. Above him towered Empress Zara Volthrax, 9 feet of emerald skin etched with gold patterns that pulsed like circuit boards beneath flesh. Midnight bronze armor clung to a frame built for dominance, each plate shaped to highlight curves both statuesque and lethal. Her crimson cape edges embroidered with 47 Conquered System sigils pooled on the deck behind her like spilled blood. Hair the color of living flame cascaded over shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of empires. But her eyes, molten amber twin suns burning in a face carved from wrath and solitude. The guard captain's voice cracked through the tension. Majesty, execute him. He insulted you before the entire galaxy. Tom's Texas drawl emerged steady despite the talon at his jugular. Ma'am, with respect, truth ain't an insult. Zara's voice rolled like thunder across mountains. You dare. Yes, ma'am, because you're beautiful, and they've been blind. The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as the rarest mineral in the quadrant. Her gaze flickered. Not with rage, with something far more dangerous. No one, her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the vast chamber, has called me that in 100 years. Let me tell you how a 68-year-old widower from Texas ended up 1 second from death and changed the fate of empires. 36 hours earlier, Thomas Caldwell was invisible. Concordia Nexus sprawled across 3 cubic miles of manufactured gravity and recycled atmosphere, a crossroads where 1,000 worlds conducted their endless negotiations, trades, and carefully calibrated betrayals. The station never slept. Its vaulted atriums throbbed with overlapping dialects, the scent of alien spices sharp enough to make human eyes water, and the constant background hum of graviton engines, keeping 50,000 souls from drifting into the void. Tom worked in the shadows between these grand spaces, fixing the systems that kept diplomats comfortable enough to argue without killing each other. The graviton generator in Sector 7 had been making a grinding noise for 3 days. Station maintenance had logged the complaint and promptly forgotten about it. Tom hadn't. He'd learned long ago that small problems ignored became catastrophic failures. And catastrophic failures in space meant bodies floating in vacuum. His jumpsuit bore no rank insignia, no unit patches. Nothing to indicate he'd once been combat medic. Thomas Caldwell. 1st Armored Division, the man who'd kept 17 soldiers alive during a firefight outside Basra, when enemy artillery turned their field hospital into a burning nightmare. Now he was just the guy who kept toilets flushing and air breathable. The generator housing required him to crawl through a maintenance shaft barely wider than his shoulders. His knees protested arthritis, the gift that kept on giving from too many years kneeling on desert sand and starship decks. But his hands moved with the same precision they'd shown, threading sutures through shredded tissue. Some skills never left you, even when everything else did. 30 years since Desert Storm. He still read people like trauma patients, who was bleeding out, who was hiding pain, who needed help they'd never ask for. The shaft opened onto a catwalk overlooking the Grand Concourse. Below, 3 rival guild representatives argued over trade routes with the kind of passion usually reserved for religious wars. Tom recognized the players from previous disputes. The avian rep's crest feathers were flattened stress response, probably lying about cargo capacity. The crystalline merchant gripped his chair with enough force to leave finger indentations in the metal, ready to walk away from the table. The human guild leader kept his eyes fixed on his datapad, classic avoidance behavior, hiding something significant. Tom had seen the same patterns in combat negotiations. The Iraqi officer who wouldn't meet your eyes had already decided to fight. The one who leaned forward wanted a deal but couldn't admit it. Reading body language had kept him alive when trust could get you killed. The negotiation below collapsed predictably. Chairs scraped. Voices rose in 3 different languages, none of them polite. The avian spread his wings in a threat display that sent merchant stalls scattering. Security moved in hands on shock batons. Station Chief Morrison's voice bellowed from somewhere in the chaos. "Caldwell, get down here and clean this mess up." Tom descended the access ladder with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent 2 decades being summoned to fix other people's disasters. Broken glass crunched under his boots. A data pad lay shattered, still displaying whatever classified information the guild leader had been hiding. "Yes, sir." He pulled out a magnetic broom and started gathering the larger shards. Invisible. Useful. Forgotten the moment he finished. But something nagged at him. All 3 guild representatives had checked their personal communicators before the argument escalated. Same gesture, same timing. In his peripheral vision, he'd caught the telltale glow of priority encrypted messages. 3 rivals receiving simultaneous transmissions, then immediately manufacturing a dispute violent enough to require security intervention. His medic brain cataloged the anomaly and filed it under problems for people who get paid to care. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Keep your head down. Do your Gia. Go home alive. Except he hadn't gone home in 10 years. Home was a 2-bedroom house in San Antonio that he'd sold after Rebecca died. Home had been the sound of his son's laughter before an IED outside Fallujah turned David into a folded flag and a 21-gun salute. The station lights dimmed. Not a flicker, not a power fluctuation. A deliberate reduction of illumination that rippled through the concourse like a wave of shadow. Sound died. Conversations cut off mid-word. The background hum of graviton engines seemed to hold its breath. Even the merchant hawking Andromedan silks fell silent, his 6 manipulator arms frozen in mid-gesture. Tom straightened from his cleaning instinct, prickling the back of his neck. He'd felt this before, the moment before enemy artillery announced itself with a shriek of incoming death. The pregnant pause when everyone knew something terrible was about to happen, but couldn't yet see it. Obsidian armored guards marched into the concourse in perfect formation. Each stood 7 feet tall, their armor absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Plasma rifles held at present arms hummed with barely restrained violence. Their footsteps synchronized into a rhythm that echoed off the vaulted ceiling like war drums. Behind them walked figures in robes darker than void itself, courtiers whose faces remained hidden within deep cowls. They moved like smoke, like whispers, like the rumors that preceded imperial judgments. Then she entered. Empress Zara Volthrak stepped into Concordia Nexus, and the station itself seemed to contract around her presence. Tom's first coherent thought, "Good Lord." His second, "I need to see this properly." He stood on the lower level, blocked by pillars and merchant stalls, and the backs of beings who'd all simultaneously remembered the importance of appearing small. The avian who'd been ready to fight moments ago had his crest pressed flat against his skull, wings folded tight eyes fixed on the floor. The crystalline merchant had gone completely still, his internal lattice structure dimmed to near transparency. The human guild leader had dropped to one knee so fast Tom heard the joint crack. Tom moved toward the maintenance catwalk that ringed the upper level. Not fleeing, nobody fled when the Empress arrived. That only drew attention, just a maintenance worker returning to his duties through the least visible route. The catwalk put him 40 feet above the concourse floor with an unobstructed view. Zara Volthrax moved like a storm-given form, each step a declaration of sovereignty. The emerald of her skin caught the muted station lights and transformed them into something alive, something that pulsed with its own internal fire. The gold patterns etched into her flesh weren't tattoos or paint. They glowed from within, circuit-like traceries that mapped power across muscle and bone. Her armor had been forged by craftsmen who understood that protection and beauty weren't mutually exclusive. Each bronze plate fit perfectly, highlighting rather than concealing the warrior's frame beneath. The crimson cape flowed behind her like captured sunset, its edges embroidered with sigils that represented worlds conquered, treaties signed in the shadow of overwhelming force, civilizations that had learned to bow or burn. Tom's mind, trained by 30 years of studying alien physiology for medical purposes, cataloged details with clinical precision. Bipedal humanoid structure, approximately 9 feet in height, musculature indicating strength-to-mass ratio far exceeding human norms. Bone structures suggested enhanced density. The way she moved spoke of perfect proprioception, each gesture controlled with the precision of someone who'd spent decades learning exactly how dangerous her own body could be. His heart, the part of him that had been dormant since Rebecca's funeral, cataloged something entirely different. perfect symmetry and facial structure, mathematical precision that human faces never quite achieved. The artistry of those gold patterns flowing across her skin like rivers of light following the landscape of her body. The raw power in her presence, yes, but also something else. Something in the set of her jaw. The way she held her shoulders just slightly too rigid, the micro-expression that flickered across her face when she thought no one was watching. Loneliness. Isolation so profound, it had carved lines into the corners of those burning eyes. The weight of a crown that never came off, not even in whatever passed for sleep in the private chambers of an empress who'd spent a century teaching the galaxy to fear her name. He'd seen that expression before in the mirror, in the years after they'd lowered David into Texas soil. Her head turned. Her gaze swept the concourse, tracking across the bowed heads and averted eyes of beings who understood that looking upon the Empress uninvited meant death. Their eyes met. 40 feet of vertical distance, 100 yards of horizontal space, 50,000 souls holding their collective breath. Her stare locked onto his weathered brown ones, and the universe contracted to that single connection. The avian diplomat Kellis stood beside Tom on the catwalk, having apparently fled to the same refuge. His voice emerged as a strangled whisper. "You fool! You just signed your death warrant." Tom barely heard him. Time stretched each second, expanding into years. He watched her expression shift, fractionally, watched the minute change in her posture as she processed this human, this small, insignificant maintenance worker who dared to meet her gaze. Her bronze talon rose, pointing directly at him across the vast space. When she spoke, her voice carried perfectly, despite the distance, amplified by technology or biology or sheer force of imperial will. "You, human." Guards surged toward the catwalk access ladder. Their armored boots hammered against metal grating. Plasma rifles swiveled toward Tom's position, targeting lasers painting red dots across his chest. Kellis stumbled backward, his translator device stammering apologies in 3 languages. Other beings on the catwalk scattered, desperate to put distance between themselves and the target of Imperial attention. Tom stood perfectly still. His heart hammered against his ribs. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. 2 guards reached the catwalk first, their hands closing on his arms with enough force to bruise. They lifted him easily, his boots leaving the deck as they hauled him toward the ladder. His mind registered the descent in clinical detail, 23 rungs, guards above and below, no possibility of escape, even if he'd been 30 years younger and inclined toward suicide. They threw him down at Zara's feet. The impact drove the air from his lungs. The deck plating was cold against his palms as he pushed himself to his knees. Every diplomatic protocol he'd ever heard said to keep his eyes down, to prostrate himself, to beg for mercy from the being who could order his execution with a gesture. He looked up instead. From ground level, Zara Volthrax was a mountain. Her boots, reinforced bronze that could crush bones with casual pressure, stood inches from his hands. His eyes tracked upward, past armored legs, past the crimson cape that whispered against the deck, past the curve of protective plating. Her face, the face that stared down at him, with an expression caught between curiosity and the kind of cold rage that preceded orbital bombardments. Courtiers hissed from the shadows. Guards shifted their grips on weapons. Somewhere in the gathered crowd, someone whispered a prayer in a language Tom didn't recognize. Zara's voice emerged low, dangerous, with the kind of controlled fury that promised violence. "Do you know who I am?" His Texas drawl had never sounded more out of place. "Yes, ma'am. Empress Zara Volthrax, the Jade Sovereign." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Speaking her name directly, using her title without honorifics. Every word a breach of protocol that it could justify immediate execution. Her gaze blazed brighter. "Then you know what happens to those who dare look upon me unbidden." "I reckon I do, ma'am." She leaned down, slowly, deliberately. Her face descended toward his until he could see the individual facets in those burning eyes, until he could smell something like cinnamon and ozone and ancient stone. Her breath was warm against his skin. "And yet you stared. Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Truth or diplomacy? Survival or honesty? The choice that defined the rest of his life happened in the space between heartbeats. "Because you're beautiful, ma'am." The silence that followed had weight, texture. It pressed against Tom's eardrums and squeezed his chest and made every molecule of recycled station air feel suddenly precious. Courtiers froze mid-breath. Guards' fingers tightened on triggers, but didn't fire, waiting for the order that would turn the maintenance worker into scattered atoms. The crowd pressed back, desperate to avoid collateral damage when the Empress unleashed her fury. Zara straightened slowly, her full height reasserting itself like a mountain growing from the deck. Her massive hand fingers tipped with bronze talons that could disembowel with a casual swipe reaching toward him. Tom's body tensed involuntarily. 30 years of combat reflexes screaming at him to move, dodge, do something other than kneel there waiting for death. Her talon touched his chin, gently. The bronze warm against his skin, the pressure barely enough to register. She tilted his head up, forcing him to maintain eye contact. Beautiful. She rolled the word across her tongue like she was tasting poison or wine, unable to decide which. Her expression shifted through micro-expressions too fast for him to catalog: confusion, anger, something that might have been pain. No one has called me that in 100 years. The admission emerged barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence, it carried perfectly. Tom watched something crack in that mountain stone expression, watched vulnerability flash across features designed for imperial authority. His mouth opened before his brain caught up. "Then they've been blind, ma'am." A guild envoy somewhere in the crowd dropped to his knees and began praying loudly to gods Tom had never heard of. Another being made a sound that his translator interpreted as existential despair. Kellis, still visible on the catwalk, had both wings pressed over his eyes, as if he could somehow unhear what was happening. Zara's hand remained at Tom's chin, her talon resting against his skin with lethal gentleness. Her gaze searched his face, tracking across features weathered by 68 years of gravity and sunlight and loss. "You risk much, human." "It's not risk, to tell the truth, ma'am." The words came easier now, his Texas accent softening the edges. "Learned that in the Gulf." Her head tilted fractionally. "The Gulf." Before Tom could explain that he'd spent 1991 keeping soldiers alive in a desert halfway across Earth, before he could elaborate on the kind of truths you learn when blood and sand mixed under your hands, the grand entrance doors crashed open. A messenger armor, scorched face streaked with ash, breathing like he'd run the length of the station, stumbled into the concourse. He collapsed to one knee, his voice ragged. "Majesty, urgent transmission." Zara's attention snapped toward the messenger, but her hand remained at Tom's chin, talons still touching skin. "Speak." Confederacy fleets struck 3 colonies. Simultaneous assault. Communications severed, infrastructure crippled. The chamber erupted. Guards surged forward, hands moving to weapons. Courtiers emerged from shadows, voices overlapping in urgent whispers. The crowd that had been frozen in fear suddenly churned with panic, beings scrambling for exits, desperate to reach their own ships, before whatever came next caught them in the crossfire. Zara's presence swelled. Tom couldn't explain it medically. She didn't grow physically larger, but somehow she expanded to fill the space, her fury, a tangible thing that pressed against walls and made the deck plating vibrate. "They dare." The words emerged as a hiss that made hardened soldiers flinch. "They dare strike at my dominion while I stand here." Her generals materialized from the crowd, massive figures in ceremonial armor that bore the scars of actual combat. Their voices overlapped in a chorus of violence. "Majesty, we must respond immediately. Mobilize the fleets. Burn their worlds. You show them the cost of defiance." Tom's brain cataloged the tactical situation with the same clinical precision it had once used for triage. 3 simultaneous strikes. Perfect timing during the Empress's diplomatic visit, when half the galaxy's representatives were gathered in one location. Communications severed, which meant the attacks targeted infrastructure rather than populations. Classic isolation strategy designed to force a predictable response. His mouth opened. The words emerged before he could stop them, before survival instinct could remind him that interrupting an empress surrounded by armed guards was a creative form of suicide. "Your Majesty." His voice cut through the chaos, not loud, but with the kind of authority he'd used when telling panicked soldiers to hold still while he worked. The tone that said, "I'm trying to save your life, so shut up and listen." The chamber froze. Again. Apparently, Tom had a talent for creating these pockets of absolute silence. Every eye turned toward him. Courtiers stared in disbelief. Guards raised their weapons, finally receiving the justification they'd been waiting for. Generals' expressions promised that if the Empress didn't kill him, they'd volunteer for the duty. Zara's gaze blazed brighter than before twin suns gone nova. Her voice emerged so cold that frost should have crystallized in the air. You presume to speak now? Yes, ma'am, because that's exactly what they want. The outcry was immediate and unanimous. He dares. Silence him. Execute the human. Majesty, this insult cannot. Guards advanced from three directions, weapons raised, faces set in expressions that promised Tom's death would at least be quick. Zara raised one hand. The sound didn't just stop, it was ripped away, as if she'd reached into the fabric of reality file and deleted the concept of noise. Guards froze mid-step. Courtiers' mouths moved but produced nothing. Even the background hum of station systems seemed to quiet. Her stare pinned Tom like a spear through his chest. When she spoke, her voice was the only sound in existence. Explain. Tom pushed himself to his feet. His knees protested arthritis, old injuries, the accumulated wear of decades, but he managed to stand without swaying. Still small, still insignificant compared to the 9-foot Empress and her 7-foot guards. But standing. 3 attacks, ma'am, perfectly timed, while half the galaxy's delegates are here watching. He gestured toward the crowd of diplomatic representatives now pressed against walls and trying to look invisible. They want you to respond with fury. That's what you're known for. It's what your enemies and allies alike expect. Zara descended the 3 steps from the ceremonial dais, each footfall making the deck ring like a bell. She moved with predatory grace toward Tom, closing the distance until her shadow swallowed him completely. And what would you have me do instead? Small ones speak plainly. Tom held her gaze. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice emerged steady. If you strike the way they expect you play their game, ma'am, they've prepared for it. They'll counter, and the galaxy will watch you bleed militarily and politically. He took a breath. The next words would either save his life or end it. But if you don't, if you answer with elegance instead of force, you steal their entire plan. Zara stared down at him. The silence stretched so long that Tom's legs began to ache from holding position. Her expression cycled through calculations he couldn't follow, strategic considerations that involved variables he'd never understand. Finally, her lips curved, not into a smile, nothing so human or gentle, into something stranger, sharper, more dangerous. You will come with me. Not a request. A command that carried the weight of imperial authority and the promise of consequences for refusal. Aboard the Obsidian Colossus, her flagship, the mountain of steel and fury that could crack planets. Tom had seen it on approach scans, a dark mass that occluded stars. You will explain this elegance. She leaned down, her face close enough that he could see his own reflection in those burning eyes. But know this, if your words falter, you will die without ceremony. Tom bowed. Not the full prostration that protocol demanded, just a respectful nod that acknowledged both her authority and his own spine. His lips tugged into something that felt uncomfortably like a smile. Understood, Majesty, but I think you'll find truth often outlives fear. For the second time, Zara's expression shifted into something Tom couldn't quite categorize. Not approval, not anger, something caught between curiosity and the kind of dangerous interest that preceded either alliance or annihilation. The Obsidian Colossus wasn't a ship. It was a declaration of dominance forged in metal and fury, a 3-mile-long statement that said, I can crack your world, and I'm not even trying. Tom stood in the primary hangar bay, a space large enough to house a small city, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. The bay's ceiling disappeared into darkness far overhead. Fighter craft lined the walls in perfect rows, each one capable of reducing a ground installation to molten slag. The deck plating beneath his boots had been polished to a mirror shine, reflecting lights that pulsed with emerald energy. Soldiers stared at him, not the curious stares of people encountering something unusual. The hostile stares of warriors who saw an insect that had somehow crawled into their pristine warship and needed to be crushed. 2 guards flanked him, their hands resting on weapons, but not quite drawing them. They'd been assigned escort duty, and clearly considered it an insult to their capabilities. Tom was 68, unarmed, and stood barely 6 feet tall. The fact that their empress had ordered this escort suggested either unprecedented caution or unprecedented interest, and neither option made the guards happy. The journey from hangar to command spire took 20 minutes through corridors vast enough to accommodate shuttlecraft. Tom's maintenance work had given him a good sense of ship architecture, but the Colossus operated on a scale that made civilian stations look like children's toys. Every surface spoke of military precision, no decorative elements, no wasted space, nothing that didn't serve the dual purposes of function and intimidation. They passed crew quarters where soldiers stood at attention in doorways, weapons within easy reach. They traversed ammunition storage facilities where the smell of cordite and ozone hung thick enough to taste. They climbed through vertical shafts using gravity lifts that made Tom's stomach lurch in ways he'd thought he'd left behind in the Gulf. The command spire. Tom stepped through the armored doors and his breath caught despite himself. Holographic projections filled the chamber like three-dimensional constellations. Entire star systems rendered in perfect detail, each planet tagged with the strategic data that scrolled past faster than human eyes could track. Fleet positions marked by color-coded icons. Supply routes traced in threads of light. Tactical overlays that showed firing solutions, escape vectors, and the kind of information that generals dreamed about having. Officers moved through the chaos with choreographed precision, their voices creating a symphony of controlled communication. Each wore armor-bearing unit insignia. Tom didn't recognize their bodies marked with scars that spoke of campaigns fought in vacuum and atmosphere and the strange spaces between. At the chamber's heart, towering above the tactical displays like a goddess of war, surveying her domain, stood Zara. Her crimson cape had been replaced by something more practical, a command mantle that draped across her shoulders without impeding movement. The decorative armor was gone, traded for plates designed for function over form. But somehow this stripped-down version made her more intimidating, not less. This was the Empress who had conquered 47 systems, not the diplomatic figure who attended station negotiations. She turned as Tom entered her gaze, tracking his approach across the command deck. Officers parted before him, their expressions ranging from confused to hostile to carefully neutral. Admiral Vaynar, report. A scarred veteran whose voice rasped like gravel over stones stepped forward. His armor bore marks that suggested he'd been personally shot, stabbed, and set on fire at various points in his career. 3 colonies struck Majesty, Prime Nethra Azure Hub, and Ardan's Reach. Infrastructure crippled. Communications relays severed. Initial casualty reports minimal. They targeted facilities, not populations. Tom moved forward before he could stop himself, ignoring the way guards' hands tightened on weapons. He pointed to the tactical display where 3 star systems pulsed red against the green of Dominion space. Notice the pattern, ma'am. Every officer in the command spire stiffened, the human maintenance worker addressing the Empress directly using her familiar title, pointing at tactical displays like he had any right to strategic analysis. Zara's head tilted fractionally. Continue. They didn't bomb cities, didn't slaughter civilians, just cut communications. Tom's finger traced lines between the 3 systems. Classic isolation strategy. Your colonies can't call for help, can't coordinate defense, can't even confirm they're not the only ones hit. He pulled up archived tactical files from his time in the Gulf muscle memory, from training sessions that felt like ancient history. Iraqi forces used similar tactics in Kuwait. Sever command and control first, then force your enemy into predictable response patterns. Admiral Vaynar's rasp intensified. And what response do they expect? Breakthrough with overwhelming force. Tom gestured to the fleet positions surrounding the affected systems. You'll want to smash through their blockades, restore communications by brute strength. That's doctrine. That's what your enemies know you'll do. Zara descended from her observation platform, each step ringing against metal. She moved to the tactical display, her massive hands manipulating holographic controls with surprising delicacy. The projection shifted, zooming in on Confederacy fleet positions. And if I do, I become predictable. Yes, ma'am. If I do not, I appear weak. Tom met her gaze across the glowing display. Not if you choose a third path. General Kravnos, a massive figure whose tusks bore etched kill counts, slammed one fist against the tactical table. The impact made holographic planets wobble. Who is this human? The question hung in recycled air, thick with ozone and tension. Tom straightened, despite his protesting spine. Thomas Caldwell, sir. Combat Medic, 1st Armored Division, Desert Storm, 1991. Saw my share of tactical patterns. The command spire went absolutely silent. Kravno stared. Admiral Vayner's expression shifted from hostility to something approaching interest. Other officers exchanged glances that suggested they were rapidly recalibrating their assessment of the small human who'd been dragged aboard as the Empress's curiosity. Zara's voice emerged low, dangerous, and somehow satisfied. A soldier, that explains the spine. She moved closer to the display, her attention fixing on fleet dispositions with the kind of focus that made planets surrender without firing a shot. Tell me more, Thomas Caldwell. How would you restore communications without appearing to wage war? Hours bled into each other aboard the Obsidian Colossus, time measured not by chronometers, but by the evolution of strategy taking shape across holographic star charts. Tom stood beside Zara's command throne, a position that should have been occupied by generals, not maintenance workers, and watched an empire's doctrine crack open. His fingers traced routes through the tactical display, marking hidden star lanes that mining corporations had charted decades ago and promptly forgotten when the veins ran dry. Zara's massive hand moved in parallel, annotating his suggestions with fleet assignments that transformed theory into executable orders. They worked in a rhythm that felt almost choreographed, his tactical suggestions flowing into her strategic genius until the plan belonged to neither of them individually but to the space between. Whisper-class vessels through the Cador Drift. Tom highlighted a debris field that registered as navigation hazard on standard charts. Most captains won't risk it, but your stealth ships can navigate the gaps. Zara's gaze tracked the route calculations flickering behind her eyes. 18 hours to prime Nethra. The Confederacy expects us from standard approach vectors. They're watching at the front door while you slip through the basement window, ma'am. Admiral Vayner leaned over the display, his scarred features illuminated by tactical projections. And when we restore communications, the Confederacy will know we've outmaneuvered them. Tom pulled up intelligence reports on enemy fleet composition, information he shouldn't have access to, but nobody seemed inclined to stop him. That's when you see the propaganda networks. Empress Zara seeks diplomatic resolution. Make them think you've gone soft while your ships do exactly what needs doing. General Kravnos growled his tusks, catching the emerald glow of ship systems. This defies every principle we've built. The Dominion rules through overwhelming force, not deception. Zara straightened to her full height, presence expanding, until the command spire felt smaller. Strength is not only in firepower, General, it is in the mind that directs it. Her voice dropped to something colder than vacuum. The Dominion evolves or it dies. This discussion is finished. Officers shifted, some faces set in disapproval, others showing the kind of careful neutrality that meant they agreed but wouldn't say so publicly. The tension stretched until Admiral Vayner broke it with a sharp nod. Coordinates locked. Stealth flotilla deploying within 6 hours. Zara gestured toward a side chamber adjacent to the command spire, a tactical briefing room where holographic displays gave way to transparent alloy showing the infinite scatter of stars. Tom followed, acutely aware that every officer watched him walk beside their Empress like he belonged there. The briefing room's silence felt different from the command spire's controlled chaos. Here, the infinite void pressed against reinforced windows, a reminder that all their strategies and empires amounted to temporary islands in an ocean of darkness. Zara stood at the viewport, her reflection ghostly against the star field. Without the armor, without the audience of officers and courtiers, she looked less like a weapon and more like a woman carrying weight that would have crushed mountains. You spoke of beauty. Her voice emerged quieter than he'd heard it, though still carrying that resonance that made human vocal cords seem inadequate by comparison. Now, brilliance. What do you see, Thomas Caldwell? Tom moved to stand at a respectful distance, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to acknowledge their difference in station, and chose truth over survival. A woman taught to wield fear like a weapon, ma'am, but who could build something greater if she chose? Her gaze found his reflection in the viewport, rather than turning to face him directly. No one speaks to me this way. Maybe that's the problem, ma'am. The silence that followed felt less hostile than contemplative. Zara's massive hand rested on the viewport frame, bronze talons catching starlight, and Tom noticed the tremor in her fingers that she suppressed almost immediately. Before either could speak again, the command spire alarm shrieked. They burst back into tactical control to find officers surrounding a data stream that painted the holographic display in hostile crimson. An intelligence officer whose species Tom didn't recognize spoke in clipped, urgent syllables. Majesty intercepted transmission. Traitor within the fleet. The words fell like artillery shells. Zara's command voice cracked across the spire. Source. Data cascaded through holographic space, months of encrypted signals, fleet deployments transmitted to Confederacy Command, tactical preferences analyzed and distributed, supply routes compromised. The intelligence officer's manipulator appendages shook as they highlighted the transmission origin point. Admiral Victor Strand. The name detonated in absolute silence. Tom watched Zara's face cycle through expressions too fast to catalog shock, denial, fury, and something that looked uncomfortably like grief. Her hand clenched into a fist that made the deck plating beneath her boots groan under redistributed weight. Admiral Strand. Tom had heard the name whispered with reverence in the corridors. The architect of Dominion doctrine, the general who'd taught 3 generations of officers that fear was the only chain strong enough to bind an empire. Zara's mentor, her second father, the man who'd forged her into the weapon that conquered 47 systems. Show me everything. The evidence spread across tactical displays like a cancer. Years of planning, every major tactical decision Zara had made in the past 18 months had been transmitted to Confederacy intelligence within hours. Fleet movements, officer assessments, psychological profiles that detailed exactly how the Empress would respond to provocation. Strand hadn't just betrayed operational security. He'd betrayed understanding, weaponizing his knowledge of Zara's training to make her predictable. Tom studied the transmission patterns with the same analytical detachment he'd once applied to triage decisions. The data showed deliberate orchestration. Strand hadn't reacted to opportunities, he'd created them. The 3 simultaneous colony strikes bore his strategic fingerprints, designed to force Zara into exactly the kind of overwhelming response that would validate his doctrine. He taught you to be his hammer, ma'am. Tom's voice cut through the officer's shocked murmurs. That's why this plan works. You're not his student anymore. Zara turned her gaze, blazing bright enough to hurt. He was like a father. Fathers should want you to outgrow them, ma'am, not control you forever. The words landed with more impact than Tom intended. Zara's expression fractured rage and pain warring across features designed for imperial authority. Her voice emerged barely above a whisper, but somehow filled the entire command spire. Bring me Admiral Strand. Tell him his Empress requests counsel on these attacks. Officers froze, confusion rippling through ranks. General Kravnos stepped forward, at tusks gleaming. Majesty, he expects immediate arrest. Execution, not invitation. Zara's smile could have cut steel exactly. The next 36 hours transformed the Obsidian Colossus into a stage for psychological warfare more brutal than any bombardment. Word spread through the fleet that Admiral Strand had been summoned for consultation, not arrest. Confusion metastasized into speculation. Officers debated in mess halls whether their Empress had gone mad or was playing a game beyond their comprehension. Tom spent those hours coordinating with stealth flotilla commanders, his maintenance worker credentials, somehow transformed into tactical advisory authority by Zara's explicit field promotion to commander, a rank that came with enough authority that officers could follow his orders without violating chain of command. Nobody questioned it directly. The Empress's will was law. But he caught the sideways glances, the muttered conversations that stopped when he entered compartments. The first colony's communications came back online 18 hours after the attack. Prime Nethra's garrison commander appeared on holographic display, his relief palpable, even through the light lag. Majesty, we thought ourselves abandoned. The Confederacy blockade never saw your ships approach. Zara's voice carried satisfaction, sharp as broken glass. They were watching the wrong vectors, Commander. Status report. Infrastructure damaged but repairable. Civilian casualties under 50. Enemy forces in complete disarray. Their blockade rendered irrelevant by communications they didn't know had been restored. The second and third colonies reported similar success over the following hours. The Confederacy had positioned fleets to counter overwhelming force, not surgical infiltration. Their admirals were still waiting for the hammer blow that would never come. Tom watched Zara coordinate the operation from her command throne and understood why entire civilizations surrendered at the mention of her name. This wasn't the diplomatic figure who'd walked into Concordia Nexus. This was the tactical genius who'd conquered 47 systems, every gesture precise, every order delivered with absolute confidence. She caught him observing, and one corner of her mouth curved fractionally upward. The expression vanished before anyone else could notice, but Tom felt its impact like a physical touch. Admiral Strand's shuttle arrived with all the ceremony befitting a legendary general. Thousands of soldiers lined the hangar bay in formation, their armor polished to mirror brightness weapons at ceremonial present arms. The display should have honored a hero returning from campaign. Instead, it felt like a funeral. Tom stood in the observation gallery overlooking the hangar, watching the shuttle descend with the grace of a serpent entering its den. Zara had positioned him there deliberately visible to Strand, a message in human form about everything that had changed. The shuttle doors hissed open. Admiral Victor Strand emerged like history made flesh. Emerald skin dulled by age and scar tissue, armor bearing dents from 100 battles, each mark left deliberately unrepaired and testament to survival. His gaze cold and calculating, the look of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that turned cities to ash and called it strategy. He walked with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable even now. His shallow bow toward the observation deck where Zara watched carried more arrogance than respect, the gesture of a teacher acknowledging a student who'd summoned him. Majesty, his voice carried across the hangar with practiced projection. I came as soon as I heard of these attacks. I am ready to advise you on proper retaliation. Murmurs rippled through the assembled soldiers, some approving, others uncertain. Strand's doctrine still commanded loyalty among traditionalists who'd learned warfare at his knee. Zara descended from the observation gallery with theatrical precision, each step timed to build tension. Her crimson cape flowed behind her, freshly restored for this performance. When she reached the hangar deck, she gestured toward the holographic display that materialized at her command. Tell me, old master, what should I do? Strand moved to the display with the ease of someone who'd given this lecture countless times. His fingers manipulated tactical projections, pulling up Confederacy fleet positions and Dominion assets, with the kind of access that should have been revoked the moment his betrayal surfaced. The only path is the true path, Majesty. His voice resonated with conviction that decades of success had forged into certainty. Strike their colonies, burn their fleets, bombard their worlds until even ash fears your name. He turned to face the assembled soldiers, playing to his audience. That is the way of strength. That is the way of the Dominion. Tom's voice cut through the growing murmur of agreement. How convenient, sir. Every head swiveled toward the observation gallery where he stood. Strand's cold gaze found him assessment and dismissal happening in microseconds before his lip curled in disgust. And what is this, a pet you've adopted, Majesty? Strand's gesture encompassed Tom's uniform, his weathered features, his complete lack of traditional military bearing. A human insect advising the crown. Soldiers hissed approval, courtiers whispered agreement, the kind of tribal solidarity that happened when an outsider threatened established hierarchy. Zara's voice emerged controlled, each word precisely weighted. Commander Caldwell has offered insights of greater worth than some who served me a lifetime. The title commander dropped like a grenade. Strand's composure cracked fury, bleeding through the careful mask. Commander, this human. Zara activated a different holographic display. Instead of isolated colonies gasping in communication darkness, the projection showed current status. All 3 colonies restored supply lines flowing. Confederacy blockades rendered tactically irrelevant. Strand staggered, genuine shock breaking through decades of strategic control. Impossible. Tom descended from the observation gallery, his boots ringing against deck plating in the sudden silence. Not impossible, sir. Just elegant. Zara pulled transmission logs into holographic space, the web of Strand's betrayal spreading across tactical displays like a cancer's growth pattern. Months of encrypted signals. Years of psychological profiling. The complete architecture of orchestrated treason. You fed them my doctrine. Zara's voice dropped to something colder than vacuum death. You trained me to be your hammer, to wield fear as law. and you thought me shackled to your lessons. She leaned forward, her towering frame casting Strand in shadow. But I am no longer your weapon. I am my own storm. Guards surged forward at her gesture, their ceremonial weapons suddenly combat-ready. Strand struggled as they seized his arms, his voice shaking the hangar with decades of command authority. Majesty, this path will ruin us. Fear is the only way to rule. Tom stepped closer, his Texas drawl carrying surprising weight in the charged atmosphere. No, sir. Terror might compel obedience, but only trust inspires loyalty. The hangar fell silent except for the hum of graviton engines and Strand's labored breathing. Zara's gaze swept across assembled soldiers measuring loyalty and doubt in expressions that tried desperately to remain neutral. Her voice rang out with imperial authority. You betrayed me. You betrayed the Dominion. And worst of all, you betrayed the future. Strand was led away in chains, his protestations fading as blast doors sealed behind him. The soldiers remained at attention, uncertain whether to celebrate or mourn the fall of a legend. Tom felt the weight of thousands of eyes assessing him, this human who'd somehow become the fulcrum on which their empire's future balanced. The days following Strand's arrest churned with unrest that threatened to tear the fleet apart. Soldiers trained for 3 generations under fear doctrine principles found themselves adrift, uncertain whether the new path represented evolution or betrayal of everything that had kept the Dominion strong. Tom walked corridors that hummed with tension, aware that his presence represented everything traditionalists despised. Twice he was confronted by officers whose body language screamed challenge, even when their words stayed barely within protocol. Once a maintenance shaft access he needed was mysteriously locked, forcing him to reroute through sections where hostile glares followed his every step. He'd faced worse in the Gulf, when Iraqi civilians caught between armies had looked at American medics with eyes that promised violence if opportunity presented itself. You didn't survive those situations by backing down or by escalating. You survived by doing your job with quiet competence until grudging respect replaced hostility. The night everything changed began with alarms. Tom woke in quarters that barely qualified as a closet, his assigned berth among the ship's lower decks, where support staff bunked in spaces designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The alarm shriek penetrated bulkheads designed to muffle combat noise, which meant whatever was happening qualified as ship-threatening emergency. His hands found his boots and the emergency medical kit he kept beside his bunk before his brain fully processed the transition from sleep to crisis. 30 years of military training created reflexes that age couldn't completely erase. The corridor outside was chaos. Emergency lighting bathed everything in crimson shadows. Smoke boiled from ventilation shafts. Soldiers ran past in combat gear, their weapons armed and tracking for threats. The deck plating vibrated with the impacts that felt too close, too powerful to be anything except sabotage charges. Tom's medic instincts overrode self-preservation. He moved toward the sounds of distress following the smoke trail to a collapsed corridor where emergency bulkheads had sealed but not before trapping soldiers in the blast zone. 3 bodies lay in twisted metal and sparking conduits. Tom dropped beside the nearest a female soldier whose emerald skin had gone pale blue-green blood, pooling beneath her torso from a chest wound that would have killed a human in minutes. Talk to me, soldier. Name? Her eyes struggled to focus pain and shock, warring for dominance. Lyra, I'm dying. No, you're not. Not on my watch. Tom's hands moved with precision, born from too many field hospitals, too many soldiers bleeding out, while artillery turned the world into fire and noise. Your species has redundant cardiovascular systems, right? 2 hearts. She managed a weak nod. Primaries compromised, but secondaries strong. Work with me, Lyra. His medical kit contained supplies designed for human physiology, but blood was blood, regardless of species. Stop the bleeding, stabilize the patient, buy time for proper treatment. He used torn uniform fabric as pressure bandages, applied clotting agents that worked on protein structures universal enough to cross species barriers, and talked constantly because shock killed as efficiently as blood loss. You're doing great. Keep breathing. That's it. You have got people waiting for you somewhere, right? Someone who needs you to keep breathing. Lyra's eyes focused slightly, daughter, 7 years old. Then you're not dying today because that little girl needs her mother. Tom's hands moved to the second soldier, applying tourniquet techniques while maintaining pressure on Lyra's wound. "You're all going to medical, all of you. Just stay with me." Footsteps thundered from both directions, soldiers converging on the damaged site weapons, ready for enemies who'd already fled. But instead of relief, Tom saw their expressions shift from combat alertness to something uglier when they recognized him. The human. A squad leader whose armor bore Strand Loyalist insignia. "This is his fault. His doctrine brought this." Tom kept working his boss steady despite the rifles now tracking his movements. "Your shipmates are bleeding out. You can blame me later. Right now, help me get them to medical." The squad leader's weapon didn't lower. "Why should we listen to?" "Because I'm a medic and they're dying." Tom's voice cracked with authority he hadn't used in decades, the tone that had once made panicked soldiers obey without question. "You can shoot me after they're stable. Right now, move." Something in his voice, or maybe the sight of Lyra's blood spreading across deck plating, broke through ideological rigidity. Soldiers moved forward, their training overriding their anger, lifting wounded comrades with surprising gentleness. Tom worked through 2 more casualty sites before assassins found him. They came from maintenance shafts he'd been crawling through just hours earlier. Their faces covered weapons designed for silent killing rather than shipboard combat. 6 trained warriors converging on one 68-year-old medic who'd been foolish enough to separate from armed escort. Tom's brain cataloged tactical reality with brutal clarity. He couldn't win this fight. He couldn't even survive it long enough for help to arrive. But he could buy time for the wounded soldiers limping toward medical bay, could draw the assassins away from easier targets. His hand found a medical laser designed for cauterization, not combat, and thumbed it to maximum intensity. The first assassin charged with blade drawn. Tom waited until the last possible moment before triggering the laser directly into the attacker's visual sensors. The scream was gratifying, even as the second assassin's blow caught him in the ribs, pain exploding across his chest in ways that suggested cracked bones. He went down hard, his head bouncing off deck plating. The medical kit spilled, supplies scattering. His vision swam, but his hands found a gravity field modulator maintenance tool wildly dangerous if misused and triggered it toward the ceiling. 2 assassins slammed upward into bulkhead plating with force that ended their participation. The remaining 3 adjusted tactics, spreading out to attack from multiple angles, with the kind of coordination that spoke of special forces training. Tom fought like a cornered animal, using every dirty trick he'd learned in his 68 years of surviving situations designed to kill him. Pressure points that worked across species, environmental hazards turned into weapons, anatomical knowledge that let him target nerve clusters with precision, even when his vision blurred from blood loss. But there were too many, and he was too old, and his body simply couldn't do what his brain demanded anymore. The 4th assassin's blade caught him across the shoulder, pain white-hot and immediate. The 5th drove a boot into his already injured ribs. Tom hit the deck again this time, unable to rise, his vision tunneling toward unconsciousness. The 6th assassin raised a weapon that would end this with merciful quickness. The bulkhead exploded inward. Zara crashed through reinforced alloy like it was tissue paper, her presence filling the corridor with fury made manifest. The assassins who'd been seconds from killing Tom scattered, but she moved faster than physics should allow for something her size. Her blade obsidian alloy, longer than Tom, stood tall, cleaved through the first assassin before he'd completed his turn. The second died trying to raise his weapon. The third managed to fire, but the plasma bolts splashed harmlessly against armor designed to withstand ship-to-ship weapons. She fought like living thunder, each movement precise and devastating, and Tom watched from the deck with the kind of detached appreciation that came with significant blood loss. Beautiful and terrible, the storm-given purpose. The last assassin died screaming. Zara turned her gaze blazing, and Tom realized with distant surprise that she was terrified. Not of combat, of him dying. She dropped to her knees beside him, her massive hands hovering over his injuries with the hesitation of someone who feared their own strength. "Don't you dare leave me, Thomas Caldwell. Don't you bury here." Tom managed a weak grin despite the blood he could taste. "Not going anywhere, ma'am. Made you a promise about that future." She laughed, the sound breaking somewhere between relief and something that might have been a tone, and lifted him with impossible gentleness. Cradled in hands that could crush his bones, Tom felt safer than he had in years. Medical bay was chaos, But Zara's presence created order through sheer force of will. Doctors worked on Tom while she stood watch her shadow falling across the surgical table like a promise of violence to anyone who failed. The injuries weren't fatal: cracked ribs, deep lacerations, blood loss that would have killed someone with less stubborn determination to stay conscious. They stitched him back together while he drifted in pharmaceutical haze, aware of Zara's voice demanding updates with frequency that suggested genuine fear. He woke to find her still there, slumped in a chair, built for being as her size exhaustion, written across features designed for imperial authority. Her armor was gone, replaced by simple tunic, and without the trappings of power, she looked less like an empress and more like someone who'd spent too many years carrying impossible weight. "Did we win?" His voice emerged rough throat raw from intubation. She lifted her head, her gaze finding his, and laughed with the kind of relief that suggested she'd been holding her breath for hours. "We won, you reckless fool." Tom's smile pulled at stitches, but he didn't care. "Good. Would hate to miss what comes next." She reached over her massive hand, enveloping his with surprising gentleness. "What comes next is you recovering properly before attempting more heroics." "Yes, ma'am." Tom's eyes were already drifting closed again, the pain medication pulling him back towards sleep. "But for the record, saving people isn't heroics. It's just what medics do." The last thing he heard before unconsciousness claimed him was her voice, soft and close. "Then perhaps the galaxy needs more medics and fewer heroes." Tom spent the following days recovering while the Obsidian Colossus prepared for what came next. His medical bay window overlooked maintenance sections where crews worked around the clock, and he watched their movements with professional appreciation, even drugged on pain medication that made the edges of reality pleasantly soft. Zara visited in stolen moments between command decisions, her presence simultaneously comforting and surreal. She'd pull up a chair designed for beings half her size, enfold herself awkwardly into it, rather than loom over his bed, and they'd talk about everything except the fact that her empire balanced on the edge of civil war. On the third day, intelligence confirmed the worst: a coalition fleet was gathering at the Dominion's borders. 7 empires united by fear of what Zara's transformation represented, their combined armada dwarfing anything seen in living memory. Tom pulled himself from medical bay over doctors' protests, his ribs taped and his shoulder immobilized, but his mind clear enough to understand tactical necessity. He found Zara in the war room, staring at holographic projections that showed hundreds of enemy vessels converging like a closing fist. General Krabnos was mid-argument when Tom entered. "Majesty, we must strike with everything. Overwhelm them before they breach our borders." Other generals echoed the sentiment, voices overlapping in variations on the same theme. Meet force with greater force. Answer threat with overwhelming violence. Tom's voice cut through the din. "Ma'am, they want to shatter you in open battle, because if you fall, the Dominion falls back into fear." The war room fell silent. Tom limped forward, each step sending fire through his damaged ribs, until he stood beside Zara's position at the tactical table. "Look at them, 7 empires barely united. What holds them together?" He gestured to the fleet composition analysis. Zara's gaze tracked across the display, strategic calculations visible in her expression. "Fear of me. Fear of the old you, ma'am. The hammer. But terror makes brittle bonds." Tom pulled up historical data on inter-empire conflicts, grudges that went back centuries. What if you don't give them a battlefield? What if you give them a stage? He worked through the next hours translating Gulf War psychological operations into galactic-scale deception, phantom fleet signals, falsified intelligence, communications intercepts that could be altered and resent. Every trick he'd seen used in Desert Storm when coalition forces had made 100,000 Iraqi soldiers believe they faced overwhelming odds from unexpected directions, but applied across star systems with technology that lets you seed doubt directly into enemy command networks. Zara absorbed his suggestions and transformed them into something larger, her tactical genius shaping his experience into doctrine that officers could execute. Together, they built a strategy that was part illusion, part psychological warfare, part trust that your enemy's fear would do your work for you. "They think themselves united," Zara told her assembled commanders, her voice carrying the weight of imperial certainty. "But terror cannot hold against brilliance. We will break them without firing a shot." The deception campaign launched with the Coalition fleet still 3 days from Dominion space. Phantom signals made Zara's forces appear in 20 locations simultaneously. Intercepted communications were altered to suggest betrayals, resource hoarding, secret negotiations. Historical grievances between coalition members, conflicts that predated the current crisis by decades, were carefully amplified through channels designed to look like intelligence leaks. Tom coordinated with communications officers, his maintenance worker background, giving him insight into how information systems could be exploited. The irony wasn't lost on him. The skills that had made him invisible for decades were now reshaping galactic politics. The coalition's fracture took 72 hours from first deception signal to complete collapse, 3 days, where centuries of inter-empire grudges carefully stoked by psychological warfare, Tom designed and Zara executed, transformed alliance into civil war. 3 days became two as arguments erupted over forced deployment. Two became one as minor skirmishes broke out between supposed allies, each side convinced the other planned betrayal. On the day the coalition should have struck, it fractured instead. Two empires withdrew completely their fleets, disengaging with bitter accusations of bad faith. Three more turned weapons on each other, old grudges given permission to resurface. The Confederacy found itself isolated, its allies scattered or actively hostile, their Grand Armada reduced to a fraction of its intended strength. General Kravnos watched the enemy fleet devour itself and spoke with something approaching awe. "This is not war. This is art." Zara's smile carried satisfaction sharp enough to cut. "This is evolution." When Dominion forces finally struck, it was with surgical precision against an enemy already beaten. Command ships disabled rather than destroyed. Leadership captured alive. A victory so complete and so bloodless that the galaxy had no choice but to recognize that something fundamental had changed. Tom stood in the war room as debris fields marked where the coalition had collapsed and felt the weight of what they had accomplished. An empire transformed not through conquest, but through proving there was another way. She placed one massive hand on his shoulder, gentle despite the strength that could crush starship hulls. "You changed everything, Thomas Caldwell." He looked up at her, this impossible woman who'd somehow become the center of his world. "No, ma'am, we did, together." Her gaze softened in ways that made his heart do things 68-year-old hearts probably shouldn't attempt. "Together, yes. I find I prefer that word to many others." The moment stretched, charged with everything they hadn't said until tactical alerts demanded attention and they returned to the work of reshaping civilization. But Tom carried the memory of that look through everything that followed, a promise of futures that seemed impossible and inevitable in equal measure. The summons to Various Prime arrived 3 days after the coalition's collapse, delivered with all the diplomatic courtesy that barely masked an ultimatum. The Great Assembly demanded Zara's presence to explain her unprecedented deviation from doctrine, her reliance on human counsel, and the transformation of an empire built on fear into something the traditionalists couldn't recognize. Tom stood in Zara's private quarters aboard the Obsidian Colossus, watching her prepare for what amounted to a trial. She'd dismissed her attendants, preferring solitude for this particular ritual, though she'd allowed him to remain with a gesture that spoke volumes about how their relationship had shifted. The armor she selected wasn't the diplomatic finery she'd worn to Concordia Nexus. This was combat plate scarred from actual battles, each dent left deliberately unrepaired as testament to survival. The crimson cape bore fresh embroidery symbols representing the 3 colonies restored without bloodshed, the coalition defeated without massacre. "They'll call for your removal." Her voice emerged quieter than usual, vulnerability bleeding through, despite her attempt at imperial composure. "Some will demand your execution as the architect of heresy." Tom checked the fastenings on his own uniform. The formal dress they'd issued him carried commander insignia he still wasn't entirely comfortable wearing. "Then we better make sure they understand why heresy was necessary, ma'am." She turned her gaze, finding his across the chamber. "You don't have to stand beside me for this. I can send you somewhere safe until—" "Ma'am, with respect, we're way past safe." His Texas drawl softened the interruption. "You stood for me when I was nobody. Figure it's my turn." Her expression cycled through emotions too complex to name, before settling into something that looked uncomfortably like gratitude mixed with fear. She crossed the chamber in 3 strides, knelt to bring herself closer to his height, and placed one massive hand against his cheek with gentleness that contradicted every story ever told about the Jade Sovereign. "If they harm you because of choices I made." Tom covered her hand with both of his, the size difference absurd, but the gesture carrying weight beyond physical dimension. "Then we face that together. That's what partners do." The word hung between them, loaded with implications neither had fully addressed. Partners in strategy, certainly. But the way her gaze held his suggested depths that transcended tactical collaboration. The moment shattered when her communicator chimed with departure schedules. Zara rose, imperial mask sliding back into place, though Tom caught the tremor in her hands before she clenched them into fists. Varys Prime dominated the viewport as their shuttle descended through atmospheric layers that shimmered with defensive shields capable of repelling fleet-scale bombardment. The capital world gleamed like an emerald, set in black velvet, its cities sprawling across continents, with the kind of architectural grandeur that came from centuries of uncontested dominance. The Great Assembly Hall stood at the planet's political center, a structure that predated Zara's reign by generations. Its obsidian pillars reached toward clouds that never dared obscure the building's majesty. Crimson banners bearing the Dominion sigil, the old one, Tom noted, not the modified version Zara had commissioned, snapped in winds that felt artificially generated for dramatic effect. 10,000 representatives filled the chamber, their voices creating a sound like distant thunder, even before proceedings officially began. Tom walked 3 steps behind Zara, as protocol demanded, close enough to hear the whispers that followed their entrance, but far enough to maintain the fiction of servant rather than equal. The whispers weren't kind. Human contamination. Strand's arrest was madness. The doctrine kept us strong for 3 generations. She's forgotten what built this empire. But other voices mixed with the condemnation. 3 colonies restored without casualties. Coalition defeated without bombardment. Perhaps strength wears many faces. Zara ascended to the central dais, her presence commanding attention, despite the hostile undercurrent. Tom remained at the dais base, visible to all his position, a statement that Zara made deliberately provocative. High Chancellor Vex, an ancient figure, whose scarred features suggested he'd survived more assassination attempts than most people survived, meals rose to address the assembly. His voice carried amplification that made the chamber's acoustics irrelevant. "Empress Zara Volthrax, you stand before this assembly to answer for actions that have shaken the foundations of our civilization." He gestured toward Tom with barely concealed contempt. "You elevated a human, a maintenance worker, to command authority. You discarded doctrine that secured 47 conquests. You arrested Admiral Strand, the architect of our strength." The chamber erupted in voices that split along generational lines. Older representatives shouted agreement, their fury channeled through decades of loyalty to fear-based principles. Younger delegates countered with defenses that cited casualty ratios and diplomatic gains, their arguments grounded in pragmatic assessment rather than ideology. Zara waited for the noise to crest and break before speaking, her voice cutting through chaos with the precision of a blade through silk. "I stand before you not to apologize, but to illuminate." She activated holographic displays that filled the chamber with tactical data. 3 colonies struck. Traditional doctrine demanded immediate, overwhelming retaliation. Bombardment, fleet engagement, the hammer blow that breaks worlds. The displays shifted to show casualty projections, hundreds of thousands dead in the initial strikes, millions more in the retaliatory campaign, infrastructure devastated beyond repair for decades. Instead, we restored communications through surgical infiltration. 0 additional casualties. 3 colonies intact. Confederacy blockades rendered tactically irrelevant. New projections, actual results versus doctrinal expectations. This is not weakness. This is evolution. Chancellor Vex's expression hardened. "You risk appearing weak to our enemies. Fear maintains order. Without it, the Dominion crumbles." Tom's voice emerged before he could stop himself, carrying across the chamber with the kind of projection he'd learned addressing soldiers under fire. "With respect, Chancellor, terror might compel obedience, but only trust inspires loyalty." The assembly froze. A human speaking directly to High Chancellor, addressing the assembly without invitation. The breach of protocol was so severe that several representatives reached for weapons before remembering that the assembly floor was sanctified neutral ground. Zara didn't silence him. Instead, she gestured for him to join her on the dais, a position reserved for imperial advisors of the highest rank. Tom climbed the steps, each one sending phantom pain through his healing ribs until he stood beside Zara. Not behind, beside. The symbolism was impossible to miss. This human, Zara's voice carried weight that made the obsidian pillars seem to vibrate in sympathy, spoke truth when none else dared. He saw in me not crown, not tyrant, but a woman capable of more than the chains my training forged. She placed her hand on Tom's shoulder, the gesture carrying implications that rippled through the assembly like shockwaves. For that I named Thomas Caldwell, not servant, not mere advisor, but partner in the transformation of this empire. The chamber exploded. Younger delegates rose to their feet, voices raised in support that bordered on celebration. For the Empress, for the new dominion, brilliance over fear. But traditionalists roared opposition with equal fervor. Heresy, disgrace to our ancestors. Strand was right. The cacophony threatened to tear the assembly apart, until Zara's voice cut through with imperial authority that reminded everyone present exactly who commanded the fleets, controlled the weapons, and wore the crown. Enough. Silence crashed down like a physical force. I understand your fear. Zara continued, her voice carrying the kind of vulnerability that made her subsequent words hit harder. I was taught that fear was the only bond strong enough to hold an empire. That terror was strength. That mercy was weakness, inviting destruction. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across 10,000 representatives. I believed those lessons for 100 years. I conquered worlds with them. I built monuments to fear and called them civilization. Her hand tightened on Tom's shoulder. But fear corrodes. Fear breaks. And when I faced enemies who thought me predictable, who planned for the hammer blow they knew was coming, it wasn't fear that saved us. The holographic displays shifted again, showing the coalition fleet's disintegration, the psychological warfare campaign, the surgical precision that had won without the bloodshed doctrine demanded. It was brilliance. It was adaptation. It was the courage to become something greater than the weapon my training made me. Chancellor Vex rose again, his ancient features set in lines that suggested he had rather face orbital bombardment than continue this argument. And when the next threat emerges, when enemies test this new weakness. Tom spoke before Zara could respond, his Texas drawl carrying surprising weight in the charged atmosphere. Then they'll face something they can't predict, sir. Something that doesn't follow patterns they've spent decades learning to counter. He gestured to the tactical displays. The old doctrine was strong but predictable. Every enemy knew exactly how the Empress would respond because Admiral Strand taught her one playbook and never let her write her own. His voice hardened with conviction. You want to know what's really weak? Fighting the same way for 3 generations while your enemies adapt. That's not strength. That's suicide wearing tradition's mask. The assembly stirred younger delegates, nodding agreement, while older representatives struggled with arguments that technical accuracy made difficult to refute. A voice from the traditional faction, General Horvath, whose military achievements predated Zara's birth, rose with challenge. And what of loyalty of soldiers trained for generations under doctrine you now discard? Will they follow this new path or will we face civil war? Zara's response came not in words but in gesture. She activated communication channels that brought live feeds from across the fleet, soldiers of all ranks appearing on holographic displays that surrounded the assembly. Ask them yourself. The feeds showed crew compartments, training facilities, command decks. Soldiers who'd watched their Empress transform, who'd executed orders that defied everything they'd been taught, who'd seen victories achieved through methods their instructors would have called heresy. Captain Lyra, the soldier Tom had saved during the sabotage attack, spoke first, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd looked death in the eyes and been pulled back by unlikely hands. I serve the Empress, who values my life enough to find ways to win without spending it wastefully. That is strength worth following. Other voices joined hers, a chorus that split along generational lines but tilted decisively towards support. Younger officers spoke of adaptation and evolution. Veterans shared grudging respect for tactics that achieved objectives, without the casualty rates doctrine demanded. Even some traditionalists admitted that results were difficult to argue with when colonies stood intact and enemies lay defeated. The assembly watched this display with expressions ranging from approval to dismay, but the message was clear: the fleet had already chosen. Chancellor Vex's shoulders sagged fractionally, the gesture of someone recognizing when political reality had shifted beneath their feet. The assembly acknowledges your results, Majesty. Though many remain unconvinced that this path leads anywhere except weakness our enemies will exploit. Zara's voice carried finality. Then we will prove them wrong, together. The assembly session ended without formal resolution, which itself represented a kind of victory. No vote to remove her, no sanctions. Just grudging acknowledgement that the Empress had transformed her empire, and the assembly lacked both authority and support to reverse it. Tom walked beside Zara through corridors that emptied before them, some in respect, others in hostility, too cowardly to manifest publicly, until they reached her private chambers within the assembly complex. The rooms were grand, in the way of spaces designed to remind rulers of their importance, all soaring ceilings and windows that overlooked the capital's gleaming expanse. But they felt empty, sterile, a monument to power rather than a home. Zara dismissed her guards with a gesture, sealing the doors behind them with biometric locks that wouldn't open even for Imperial override. The isolation was deliberate, necessary, the first moment of genuine privacy they'd had since the colony attacks began. She moved to the window, her reflection ghostly against the city lights, and spoke without turning. They will try again, the traditionalists. They'll wait for the first setback, the first sign that the new doctrine falters, and they'll move to restore what was. Tom joined her at the window, standing close enough that their reflections overlapped. Then we don't give them that setback, ma'am. You make it sound simple. Her voice carried exhaustion that 100 years of rule had accumulated. As if transforming civilization through force of will alone could work. It's working already. Tom gestured toward the city below, where lights represented billions of lives, now governed by principles other than terror. You've got younger generations on your side, officers who've tasted victory without massacre, civilians who don't flinch when they see your ships overhead. He turned to face her profile, the glow of her eyes reflecting in the window. And you've got me, for whatever that's worth. She finally turned, her expression cycling through emotions before settling on something vulnerable and dangerous in equal measure. What you've shown me, Thomas Caldwell, it's not just strategy or tactics. Her massive hand reached out, cupping his face with gentleness that contradicted every story ever told about her. You've given me the belief that I could be something other than the weapon my training forged, that perhaps an empress built for conquest could also build something worth having. Tom placed both hands over hers, the gesture inadequate but sincere. You always had that in you, ma'am. I just reminded you where to look. The space between them charged with everything they'd carefully avoided acknowledging. The reality that whatever this was had transcended professional partnership, somewhere between station negotiations and coalition defeat. That the Empress and the medic had found in each other something neither had expected to need. Zara lowered herself to her knees, bringing their faces level, her voice barely above a whisper. No one has ever seen me. Not as weapon, not as storm, just Zara. Tom's response came without hesitation. Then let me be the one who does. Always. The kiss that followed was gentle, despite the size difference, awkward in execution, but perfect in intent. Her lips were warm, tasting of cinnamon, and something else he couldn't name, and Tom felt decades of isolation crack open in both of them. When they separated, her gaze held tears she'd probably never allowed herself before. I don't know how to do this, how to be both empress and whatever this is. We figure it out together. Tom's smile carried more confidence than he felt. Partners, remember. The words settled between them like an oath-carrying weight that transcended tactical collaboration or political alliance. Partners in reshaping civilization. Partners in facing whatever came next. Partners in the kind of relationship that would make historians debate whether it was beautiful or insane. Probably both. That night, traditionalist faction made their final desperate play. Tom walked the palace corridor toward his quarters, exhausted from assembly, politics, and the constant awareness that half the political establishment wanted him dead. His guard detail had been dismissed. Zara's order citing that excessive protection would signal weakness, and he'd agreed despite knowing the risk. The blade found his shoulder before he registered movement. Assassin Strand loyalist face covered moved with a professional efficiency that spoke of Special Forces training. Tom's body reacted on Gulf War reflexes, but 68-year-old muscles couldn't match a trained killer half his age. He went down ribs, screaming protest against recent injuries, vision tunneling toward unconsciousness. The assassin raised his weapon for the killing blow. Zara's roar shook the palace structure. She crashed through the reinforced door, not opening it, destroying it, her presence filling the corridor with fury that transcended reason. The assassin died before his blade completed its arc. No elegance, no mercy. Pure protective rage that reduced a trained warrior to broken meat in seconds. She dropped beside Tom, hands hovering over wounds with the hesitation of someone terrified their own strength would cause more damage. "Don't you dare leave me." Her voice broke on the words. "Don't you dare." Tom's hand found hers despite the blood making everything slippery. "Takes more than one coward with a knife, ma'am." "I'm fine." "You are not fine. You're bleeding. Again. Because of me. Because I wish, because someone's scared of what we represent." Tom managed a weak smile through the pain. "Which means we're winning." Medical bay. Doctors working with frantic efficiency while Zara stood vigil, her presence making them work faster and more carefully in equal measure. The wounds weren't fatal. Blade had glanced off bone-missed major arteries, but they were severe enough that Tom would carry new scars to match the collection he'd accumulated over 68 years. When he woke hours later, she was there. Still. Armor discarded, just the woman beneath the crown, watching him breathe like she was afraid he'd stop if she looked away. "They'll try again," she whispered when she noticed his eyes open. "Because I love you. Because you make me vulnerable in ways that terrify me." Tom's hand found hers with more strength than the doctors probably would have approved. "Then we face it together. That's what love means, ma'am." Her tears fell first time he'd seen her cry, and he realized the Empire's transformation was complete. The Empress, who'd ruled by fear, had learned to love despite it. She leaned down, pressing her forehead gently against his. "I love you, Thomas Caldwell. More than crowns or empires or the opinion of beings who will never understand what we've built. I love you too, Zara, not the Empress, not the Jade Sovereign, just you. Always you." Admiral Strand lived his remaining years in exile on a frontier world, his legacy transformed from architect of doctrine to cautionary tale about leaders who confuse control with strength. The trial had been public, the evidence overwhelming, and the sentence exile rather than execution itself, a demonstration of the new doctrine's principles. The traditionalist faction fragmented without their figurehead, some accepting the transformation, others nursing grudges that would take generations to fully dissolve. 5 years later, Thomas Caldwell, now 73, gray hair gone completely white body, showing the accumulated wear of decades, walked through corridors of the obsidian colossus and watched an empire continue its transformation. The changes were everywhere. Soldiers greeted each other with camaraderie rather than fear. Officers debated tactics openly without worrying that disagreement meant treason. Civilians from conquered worlds served alongside Dominion natives because integration had replaced subjugation. The tactical academy Tom had helped establish graduated its fifth-class officers trained in psychological warfare alongside traditional combat diplomacy before bombardment. Former enemy worlds sent their best candidates seeking alliance rather than fearing conquest. At 73, Tom still limped through academy corridors 3 days a week, lecturing on Gulf War tactics to beings twice his size who called him the Sentinel, with reverence that made him uncomfortable. The other 4 days he spent beside Zara, coordinating the transformation that rippled through 47 systems and counting. His limp was more pronounced now. Old injuries compounded by arthritis that even modern medicine couldn't completely eliminate, but cadets still straightened when he passed their respect, earned through 5 years of proving that wisdom could trump strength. He found Zara in the command spire coordinating a diplomatic mission to former enemies who'd requested alliance rather than surrender. She'd aged not at all physically, but something in her bearing had softened. The crown still sat heavy, but she wore it with grace rather than grim determination. She caught sight of him and smiled, the expression, still rare in public, but more common in private moments, they'd carved from imperial duty. That evening, they returned to their private observatory, the space that had become their sanctuary. Zara removed her armor with practiced ease, settling into furniture modified for beings her size, while Tom took his usual position beside her. The historians are already writing our story. Her voice carried amusement. Some call it the greatest transformation in galactic history. Others call it the madness of an empress who forgot her strength. Tom leaned against her side, comfortable despite the size difference. History can call it whatever helps them sleep at night. We know what it was. And what was it? Her hand enveloped his warmth and strength and gentleness combined. Two people who needed each other more than either wanted to admit, who found that strength wears faces beyond fear, who proved that empires built on belief last longer than ones built on terror. He smiled up at her, and who loved each other enough to make everyone else's opinions irrelevant. Zara's laugh rumbled through her chest, vibrating against where Tom pressed close. When did you become a poet, old medic? When I met an empress who taught me that truth doesn't need fancy words. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars that represented not conquest but possibilities. The Dominion would face challenges. Transformation was never complete, never fully stable, but they'd built foundations that could weather storms. You will age, Thomas. She spoke the words they'd both been avoiding. Decades for me, but for you. I know, ma'am. Tom squeezed her hand as much as he could, given the size difference. But we've got time yet, and we make every year count. Her grip tightened fractionally enough to feel, but never enough to hurt. Promise me something. Anything. When the time comes, and it will come, don't you dare apologize for being mortal. You've given me more life in these 5 years than I had in the 100 before. Tom's eyes burned with tears he wasn't ashamed of. No apologies, just gratitude for every day we get. They held each other as stars wheeled beyond the viewport, time passing in the peaceful silence of two souls who'd found unexpected completion. 10 more years passed. Tom at 3 was more maintenance supervisor than active lecturer, his body finally demanding concessions, his spirit resisted. But he still walked the halls, still advised on strategy, still stood beside Zara when decisions shaped civilizations. She remained unchanged, physically eternal, in ways that made his mortality more acute with each passing day. But she'd learned to treasure moments rather than mourn their finite nature, to love completely, despite knowing loss approached. One evening in their observatory, where countless conversations had shaped an empire, Tom's breathing grew labored. The medical team was summoned, but they both knew this wasn't an injury they could heal. Zara held him gently, his fragile body cradled in hands that had once crushed worlds and now held the most precious thing she'd ever possessed. I told you no apologies, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Not apologizing. Tom's voice was barely audible. Just grateful. For all of it. For you. Thomas Caldwell. She pressed her forehead against his with infinite care. You changed the galaxy. You changed me. You proved that one honest word could reshape civilization. His eyes found hers one final time. We did it together. Remember that. Always together. His final breath was peaceful, a warrior's rest after battles won through wisdom rather than weapons. Zara held him long after her tears falling on the body of the man who'd taught an empress how to love. The funeral was attended by representatives from 83 worlds, former enemies standing beside Dominion officers, all united in honoring the human who transformed their universe through nothing more than honest words and steadfast courage. Zara spoke from the dais, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast assembly. Thomas Caldwell was a maintenance worker, a medic, a human from a world called Earth who should have remained invisible his entire life. Her gaze swept across thousands of faces. But he dared to see me when no one else would. He dared to speak truth when silence was safer. He dared to love an empress who'd forgotten how to be anything except a weapon. She placed one hand over her heart. He showed me that strength wears many faces. That fear breaks, but belief endures. That one person speaking honestly can change the fate of billions. Her voice dropped to something softer. He showed me how to be Zara. Just Zara. And for that gift, I will carry his memory until the stars themselves grow cold. Years continued their march. The Dominion evolved under Zara's guidance. The principles Tom had helped establish becoming institutional rather than revolutionary. New officers learned both hammer and scalpel force, and diplomacy, fear, and trust. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Zara would visit Concordia Nexus, now a monument to the moment that changed everything. She'd stand in the exact spot where a 68-year-old medic had looked up at a 9-foot empress and called her beautiful. And every year she whispered the same words, "Thank you, my sentinel. Thank you for seeing me." The empire they'd built together continued to grow, not through conquest but through example. Other civilizations looked at the Dominion and saw not a threat but a possibility, proof that transformation was achievable. That belief could be stronger than fear. Thomas Caldwell's legacy lived on in every officer trained to think beyond doctrine, every diplomat choosing words over weapons, every civilization joining the Dominion through alliance rather than subjugation. But his greatest legacy was the Empress, who'd learned to love, who'd chosen evolution over stagnation, who'd transformed from storm to sanctuary because one honest man had dared to tell her the truth. Some said Zara never truly smiled again after Tom's death. Others claimed they sometimes caught her laughing quietly at memories only she could see. The truth was both and neither. She carried joy and grief together, the price and privilege of loving completely despite knowing it would end. In her private observatory, where they'd spent countless hours reshaping civilization, a single inscription marked the viewport. Where they'd watched stars together, he called me beautiful, and I became more than I ever imagined. Zara, in memory of Thomas Caldwell. The Sentinel's truth. And across 47 systems and counting beings told the story of the human who changed an empire with nothing but honest words, and the Empress who'd loved him enough to become someone worthy of that honesty. The galaxy had learned what Tom knew from the beginning: truth outlives fear. And love, however brief, transforms forever.